Politics is a very old game, so one of the best ways to get insight into that world is through the eyes of someone who has been there and done that. Michael Field was in politics for over 20 years. He was Labor Premier between 1989 and 1992 before retiring in 1997. He now lives on the east coast of Tasmania, where he remains a respected political commentator. Down here near the picturesque waters of Pirates Bay on the east coast of Tasmania, it's hard to imagine the turbulent life that politics can bring. Perhaps this is why former Premier Michael Field moved here after he retired. I've come down here to interview him on his thoughts on the upcoming election. Hi Michael, thank you for doing this with me today.
Look, it's a pleasure.
Excellent. So a brief first question. Who will win the federal election?
I believe Labor will, and I think Labor will quite comfortably, because I think the Liberals have a blast from the past. It's back to the 50s with Tony Abbott.
And what will the main battlegrounds be, and which of these battlegrounds have greater relevance to Tasmania?
Well, it'll all be opinion poll driven, and the battleground will be the Liberals, for some reason, have got higher opinion poll ratings on the economy, and so they will want to talk about debt. It's ludicrous, given that in the OECD, Australia's got the lowest level of debt of any country in the OECD, but nevertheless the Liberals will try and exploit that. Labor will try and talk about those things that Labor traditionally has been keen on and polling well on, and that's education and health.
Where do you think climate change and the ETS will come into this?
Well, I think it's an issue, but not a central issue, because the people, I think, will vote either Green 1 and Labor 2 if they're not happy with Labor Party's position on climate change. However, it's ironic because it was the Greens that stopped the ETS passing the Senate. In fact, we haven't got an ETS, an emissions trading scheme, because of the Greens vote. Some Liberals, in fact, voted for the ETS, and with Green support it would have passed the Senate. Unfortunately they didn't, and Labor's, I think, unfairly copping the blame, and the Greens are exploiting it.
Speaking of the Greens, just this week Bob Brown and the federal Greens have organised a deal that will see preferences from 50 seats go Labor's way. In your experience, how have political deals between the Greens and Labor worked out?
Well, generally it's in Labor's interest for them to get Green preferences, although it's marginal. Generally the people who vote Labor, the people who vote Green, generally, last time, 78%, was second preference Labor in Tasmania when there was no direction of preferences last time. So I'd expect it to affect probably 5% of the Green vote, which is fairly small, but if there's a really tight election, say in Bass, it could swing the difference.
What issues have divided the Tasmanian community in the past, and how can a new federal government help to solve them in the future?
Well, obviously, trees have been the dominant issue for a generation in Tasmania, and many governments have tried, and all have failed to resolve the issue because unless there's a devastation of the forest industry, the Greens' bottom line now has extended to no logging in native forests. It's changed over the time because it's like a lift going up. The more concessions they get, the more they demand. So it started off no logging in national estate areas. They then went to no logging in old growth forests, and now they've gone to the extreme position of no logging in native forests at all. Labor's attempts, federally and state, to resolve this issue have never worked because the Greens put in a concession in their back pocket and use that as a base for the next campaign. So
I think, is Julia Gillard's coming down later this week? Is she? Or earlier next week? Do you think there could be an announcement regarding this then?
I think that Julia Gillard will avoid forestry if she can, although I understand there are discussions now between forest interests and the conservation movement because of the impact of the conservation movement on the markets for wood chips and their threats for another advertising campaign. And it may be that this emerges as an issue, But my advice to the Labor Party nationally would be to avoid trees at all costs.
How relevant is Tasmania to the upcoming federal election?
Well, there are two marginal seats that can go either way in my view, Bass and Braddon, and so if the election's tight they could be critical in determining government. So I'd expect the leaders on both sides of the political spectrum to be concentrating in the northern electorates of Bass and Braddon. Both of those electorates are not the trendy electorate that Denison or Franklin is, or to a far lesser extent they are. And so I think that they'll be dealing with bread and butter issues in those electorates. And I think Julia Gillard's whole thrust in this campaign is to deal with those issues, although I'd expect something very substantial on climate change.
And lastly, what are your predictions? How will the Tasmanian seats fall?
Well, I'd expect, in this order, I'd say Denison, Franklin, Lyons, then Bass and Braddon being the most marginal.
But all towards Labor?
Well, at this stage it's very difficult to predict when there's, I think, 2.3% margin in Braddon and about a 1% margin in Bass. So I'd expect, so the campaign can affect those seats, and so it's a bit early to say how they'll go. It'll depend on the campaign between now and the election.
And what do you think about Denison, which is a Labor stronghold? However, Duncan Kerr's retiring, and there's a relatively unknown politician coming into the fray.
Well, usually in a federal election they're voting for parties, so it's probably maybe 2% affected by the individual involved, and so given the margin of somewhere around 15%, I'd expect Denison to be the safest Labor seat this time as it was last time.
So your predictions again, it will be tight, but you think Labor?
I think it'll be, if you're referring to the federal election, I don't think Tony Abbott's acceptable, and I'd expect, unless something dramatic happens between now and election day, to Labor to win with about the same majority as it did last time. And I'd expect in Tasmania, consistent with that pattern, us holding our seats, and that's on the assumption that forestry or another divisive issue in Tasmania doesn't rear its head as it did 2 elections ago.
Cool. Thank you very much, Michael.